A huge welcome to you all to today's webinar, exploring the positive shifts that have been accelerated by COVID-19. And we really want to kind of get under the skin, I guess, of some of those factors that have really helped support and underpin some of those positive shifts. And then draw out some of those key lessons for you as leaders to really make the most of them in the future. So I'm Matthew Hill, I'm the Insight Evaluation and Research Manager at Q, and I'll be introducing the webinar and popping up throughout with to run a bit of audience interaction. The webinar's been hosted by the Q community, so hopefully a lot of you are familiar with our work. For those who aren't, Q is a network of almost 4,000 people working across the UK and Ireland to improve health and care. We build connections across boundaries, develop skills and capabilities in improvement, support members to share ideas and knowledge, and ultimately work together on collaborations for more effective and sustainable improvement. We're led by the Health Foundation and supported by partners across the UK and Ireland. Perhaps unsurprisingly, over the last few months, we've really focused on supporting members and non-members to navigate the opportunities and challenges that have been thrown up by COVID. And actually, I really recommend visiting our website. We've got a whole range of COVID-specific resources, blogs, tools, events and groups that you can join, as well as some recently added funding opportunities. There's also more information online about the community and how you're able to apply if you are interested in becoming a member. We're delighted to be running today's session in partnership with the NHS Confederation and the AHSN Network as part of the NHS Reset campaign. I'll hand over in a moment to Neil Dixon, who'll say a bit more, but before that, I just wanted to run through some technical practicalities and get us sharing with each other just to kind of warm us up. So firstly, on the technology, the session is being recorded, so you should have consented to that as you joined. We'll be sharing some snippets of those recordings along with the slides and some headlines in the write-up after the session. We'll be running some audience engagement through Slido. I'll say a bit more about that on the next slide because we've got our first interaction. And you're also obviously welcome to use the chat throughout. We do hope that you kind of share your thoughts and questions in the chat box as we go. Equally, if that is something you find distracting and you want to just focus on the presentations, we'll share the highlights from the chat box again in the write-up from the session. Okay, so we've got our first interaction. So we really want to kind of ground the content in the rest of the session in the key positive shifts that you've seen over the last few months. So if everyone could go to slido.com either on your mobile device or you can open it in a separate browser and type in that hashtag Q8set, hashtag Q8 September. Shah will be sharing the screen of the Slido just now. That should be coming up for anyone who, for whatever reason, can't access it. So we've got this first question for you. So please name a positive service shift you've seen introduced or accelerated in the response to COVID-19. I'm sure this is something you've asked yourself and others, so hopefully you have a good response to it. We want to kind of analyse the responses a bit later, so try to be as brief as you can, just 2, 3 or 4 words. If brevity is not your strength, well, there's a bit of leeway around that, and all the responses are anonymous, so we can't hold you to account for it. That's great. I'll just give you another 30 seconds or so. So there's a whole range, isn't there, of things kind of coming through. And actually, I think it kind of reaffirms, doesn't it, that even in times of crisis, or perhaps, you know, especially during times of crisis, there's that opportunity to accelerate a whole range of kind of positive changes. I think, interestingly, some people are kind of identifying specific service shifts, whether it's kind of virtual consultations or shifts in specific service areas, whereas I guess others are thinking more about, I guess, some of those factors that kind of underpin those specific service shifts, and obviously we'll be getting into much more detail around them in the rest of the session. Great. I'll just give you a few more seconds on that. And just to say, we will be coming back to some of these responses a bit later in the session. Again, like I say, just to ground some of our thinking about how we respond and make the most of these changes in the future. In terms of today's agenda, so we're doing the welcome and scene setting now, and then we've got these 3 kind of key sessions throughout the workshop. So firstly, we'll be looking at what lies behind the service changes accelerated during COVID. Then we're going to look at one specific example of a service shift around virtual. And although that's one specific example, we'll be trying to draw out, I guess, those broader lessons that can be drawn from that specific example. And then in the final session, we'll start to think about what support and resources we really need for the road ahead, and what you need as leaders to really make the most of some of these positive shifts. Very brief introductions from us before I hand over to Neil. So I'm Matt, I've introduced myself. We're also joined by Joe and Richard. Penny will be drawing on some of the work that Joe and Richard have led over the last few months, and they'll be available in the chat box to kind of respond to any specific questions that you might have. And we've also got Jess, Shah and Fiona, who will be generally making sure that the webinar runs smoothly, and will be able to respond to any technical issues you might have in the chat box, so do let them know. Okay, handing over to you, Neil, now.
Myself. Thank you very much indeed, Matt. Delighted to be joined today by a distinguished panel who'll be reflecting on the presentations and giving their thoughts and insights on this extraordinary period in, I think, all our lives, and certainly in the life of the NHS. It's a service that's been turned upside down, or is it inside out? I don't know, but during that, it's discovered that seeming adversity can unlock innovation and remove barriers to change to a really surprising extent and at an unprecedented pace. You mentioned the NHS Reset campaign, and I'll come back to that again when we just do the resources and support issue at the end. But just to say, I think it's turned out to be more of a conversation than a campaign. It was prompted by a reaction, frankly, as we were very intensively talking to members, mostly chief execs, who are going through an extraordinary period of the pandemic. And very early on, there was a reaction which was, we don't want to talk about recovery, we want to talk about something different. If recovery implies we're going back to where we were, because we don't want to go back where we were, we want to go to somewhere new. And that has been an almost universal reaction, and I think a reflection that leaders have seen just extraordinary change going on, and a real desire to bottle and capture and make that change sustainable where it can be, recognizing, of course, that while it was adverse during that very difficult period, and we may have another one, but it was difficult. On the other hand, it was also a period which enabled people to do things in ways that they'd not been able to do before. So we've had fantastic involvement from members from that, and it certainly will be shaping our work going forward. At this stage, I'd just like to ask the panel that I'm joined by to introduce themselves and very briefly say a few words, about what they're doing to understand what we've been through, as it were, and are going through, and how we can make the most of the beneficial changes that have been emerging. So let me begin with Zoe Lelliot, who's the Chief Executive of the Health Innovation Network. Zoe.
Thank you very much, Neil, and welcome everyone to this webinar. So as Neil says, I am Chief Exec of the Health Innovation Network, which is the South London academic health science network. So I also work very closely nationally with colleagues across the AHSN network and lead on national development of programmes. So what have I been doing? We've been working at multiple levels to understand the impact. So just to give a few examples, working with local members. So for example, St George's Hospital, working with their ITU department to understand how they've been adopting innovation during this period. Working across all of South London with the 3 mental health trusts to help them evaluate the impact on staff and patients of remote consultations. We've been working at London level with London Region to understand the changes, identify the gaps in knowledge and try and craft research questions with them. And then finally, with all the partners here on this panel, the AHSN Network has been working on the Reset programme that Neil just mentioned. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Zoe. Now we move to Raj. Raj Jain is the Chief Executive of the Northern Care Alliance. So absolutely at the front line doing all this stuff. Raj, your brief reflections.
Thanks, Neil, and welcome everybody. I'm the Chief Exec of the Northern Care Alliance. For those of you who don't know what that means, is it's the specialist acute and community services and social care services in some areas of Salford, Oldham, Rochdale and Bury. We've got about 19,000 staff, about 1.3 billion to give you income, to give you a feel of the scale of the organisation. So as Neil said, we're at the front line. Well, actually my staff are at the front line working alongside their colleagues in communities. We're really clear on what the role of leadership is in our organisation, and my role, it's about being centred on the communities that we serve, on our patients and on our staff, to ensure that we're able to manage the pandemic in the most effective way through those core values that are important to us around patients, staff and the communities that we serve. We have done numerous things, and by we, I truly mean frontline staff, grabbing the urgency of the agenda that we faced and applying their innovation and expertise and professionalism to solving problems in a fantastic way, often working in collaboration with colleagues across Greater Manchester and nationally to really move the needle on quite a number of initiatives that have been hugely successful during this period of time, and more to come in this seminar. Thanks, Neil.
Okay, thanks, Raj. Can I just ask you one very brief question, which is the thing I talked about at the beginning was the extent to which the innovation that flowered was in a way really a surprise. Was it a surprise to you, and how big a thing was it across the organisation?
So what wasn't a surprise to me was that we've got thousands of staff and colleagues in the community who had lots of ideas and lots of thoughts on how to do things better. What was a surprise was the pace of change that we were able to achieve during those days. Organisational boundaries falling away, and we made decisions at a pace that I would never have imagined could have happened previously.
Thanks very much indeed. Excellent, Raj. Penny Pereira, who's the Q Initiative Director at the Health Foundation. Penny.
Thanks, Neil. I'll be brief, as I'll be sharing in a minute two projects that we've been doing as part of Q's response to COVID. On top of this, we've been creating spaces for people leading improvement work across the UK and Ireland to kind of come together, exchange notes on the positive changes they're seeing and to services and ways of working. We write up those sessions that we run and share what we can on the Q site, so check that out. We've also just launched Q's funding programme, which is going to be offering people small 30k grants to embed changes that are emerging through collaboration due to COVID. Thanks, Neil.
Okay, thank you. So from Q to Hugh McCackey, who's the National Director of Improvement at NHS England and NHS Improvement. Hugh.
Hi, Neil, thanks. There are certain places in Northern Ireland where people do pronounce Hugh as Q, so that was quite an apt comment. My name's Hugh McCackey. I'm the National Director of Improvement. I've been in post for about 16 months, or probably getting close to 18 months now. When I started, I very much saw my role as embedding an improvement approach and culture across the NHS and trying to shift, I suppose, the focus away from assurance and performance much more to continual improvement. Of course, the last 6 months have quite fundamentally changed what I was doing, but I think has also created some big opportunities. One of the things I was sort of leading and working on was the sort of opportunity for virtual consultations, and particularly the video consultation platform that we introduced. And I suppose we had in the long-term plan a sort of goal that we would introduce the video consultation platform and have it embedded by 23-24. And actually we managed to do that then in a matter of weeks. And I think it's others have commented on the speed with which we were able to introduce new things or innovations much more quickly. So we've actually reached the point where we thought we would be by 23-24. I think the other big piece of work, which we're sort of organising and facilitating, and I think bringing together is the Beneficial Changes Network, which we've created, which is bringing together a whole range of stakeholders to try and capture all the beneficial changes that people think that we've made, but which we'd want to keep and retain. And I suppose what we're trying to do is work through a sort of process of creating a network rather than just a process, but very much trying to sort of, what are the things that have worked and really worked during this period? What are the things that we would like to retain? How would we assess and evaluate what will have the biggest impact? And then how do we make that, how do we encourage or how do we make sure that those most important things are implemented, but not in, I think, the way we've potentially done at times in the past, which is a sort of, here are 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 good things to do, and trying to press those into the system. But actually, how do we create much more of an approach and a culture where we're come to a paper where we talk about creating that top-down clarity, but that bottom-up agency. So how do we create the right environment for organisation, for teams, for organisations, and for systems to actually implement the things which will and retain the things which will give us greatest value and greatest impact over the coming months.
Great, thanks very much, Hugh. And I think that point about how we spread in a different way from the traditional ways that we've done it in the past is going to be obviously crucial, and learning from some things like how the community work and so forth, and spreading some of that learning is going to be important. Okay, so we'll come back to the panel later, but for now, let me hand back to Matt, who's going to test your views on another poll before handing over to Penny for our first presentation. Matt.
Great, thanks so much, Neil. So as you say, at this stage, we really just want to test people's temperature, I guess, about how confident you are in the future. So we've got a second Slido poll. So if everyone could just open that up again, that would be great. It's the same hashtag to log in. I'm just going to stop sharing and it should jump up on the screen. So how much confidence do you have that the health system will make the most of the positive shift that you identified earlier? If you didn't identify a shift, just think of some of the shifts that you've noticed over the last few months and rate your level of confidence. And I'll just give you 30 seconds or so to respond to that. Okay, I think that's about what we were expecting. So kind of majority moderate confidence, some a little confidence, very little kind of high confidence. I think hopefully that's a good place to be. You know, so there's some confidence that perhaps we've got some of the conditions in place that we need to kind of make the most of these changes. But I think implicit in that, there's a recognition, isn't there? There's a lot of work to do. So hopefully we'll help identify some of the priorities for that work over the rest of the session. Thanks so much for sharing there. Okay, and now I'm just going to hand straight over to Penny, who's going to take us through the first content session.
Brilliant. So could have the slides up. Wonderful. Over the next 8 minutes or so, I'm going to share some work that we've been doing looking at what lies behind the service changes that we're seeing accelerate during the pandemic. So in a project that involved interviews and a review of the emerging grey literature, we focused on changes that have been a goal for some time, so such as increased virtual working or alternatives to hospital-based care, to understand why they particularly took off during COVID. I'm going to be sharing the headlines now, giving you a kind of broad overview of some ideas that we can then delve into more deeply with the panel. A little later on in the webinar, I'll be using the worked example of video consultations to unpack what that means in practice. By the end of this presentation, I'm hoping that you will want to read the full report. This is going to be published on the Health Foundation site next week. Richard, who's the lead author, is with us in the chat to answer questions if you can't wait until then. So what I'm hoping is that this is going to set up a good conversation amongst the panel and in the chat about what we need to do now as leaders to really embed and maintain momentum behind the positive service changes that we're seeing. So we've already heard on this call that out of this hugely challenging situation, there's the potential, indeed, the kind of urgent need to develop radically more effective models of healthcare. But I'm also hearing fear that the system is already reverting back to ways of working that make it hard to deliver such change. So this webinar gives us a bit of space to think clearly and tangibly about what we need to do as leaders nationally and locally now, so that we do justice to the innovation that we're seeing. And I think this starts with reflecting on where we put our attention. So you don't need me to tell you that leaders are facing overwhelming pressure and need to act. And that's only going to grow as we face the prospect of a massive backlog and with winter in the air. Given all of this, it's tempting to channel energy into capturing, locking in and ruthlessly standardising as many of the promising service innovations that we can. Yes, I suggest that alongside this, we need to be able to step back and think clearly about what the key service shifts are, what's enabled those changes, and what more is needed for them to be embedded on a sustainable basis. And then we need to cultivate the conditions that enable staff to deliver the improvements that we've seen, recognising that ongoing iteration and change will be needed just as much in the months ahead. Yes, unless we do this, we risk not only specific service changes failing to deliver their potential, but also seeing the incredible staff and patient support for change weakening when our need for it is just as great as it was in March. So to start with understanding the key shifts, this table lists changes that came up repeatedly when we asked a relatively small cross-section of clinical, managerial and patient leaders what they saw as the most significant shifts happening during COVID. Now, I'm conscious this will be too detailed to read here, but I'm just including it to whet your appetite for the full publication when it comes. This is very much selective. There are people on this panel and call who are leading larger scale, more comprehensive processes to capture and assess service innovations. What I hope this offers is just an encouragement to step back from the thousands of great ideas happening on a small scale to distill the main changes when you look across specialties and areas. I'd be really interested in whether you've done this for your patch and what you're seeing in terms of how far different changes are being adopted widely and how the different changes taking place in primary, secondary and community care are fit together. But we shouldn't stop there. We need to look beyond the service changes to also understand the ways of working that enabled them. Through the Q community, we've brought together hundreds of people leading change, both locally and from the national organisations responsible for improvement across the UK and Ireland. And again, we've heard that it's the ways of working that feel the most precious legacy of the immediate COVID response. The way that health service staff and patients have responded is partly about the unique context of the pandemic, which includes extreme pressures we would hardly want to recreate. But what we can try to hold on to is the combination of factors that prompted and enabled people to act as they did. So Richard has developed this model to distill those key ingredients. People had the tools and resources that they needed to deliver care in a different way. And there were new mindsets or beliefs that seemed to take hold sufficiently to open up new ways of doing things. Later, I'll be going deeper into what we can learn from the rapid adoption of video consultations, but just to briefly make that connection here. So people were able to move to virtual appointments because the platforms and technical tools were made available to do so, and much routine care was suspended, meaning there was time to introduce the alternative service models. Many of the choices about what to do and much of the work happened at the front line, which makes the mindsets of both clinical teams and patients particularly critical. So this table distills some of the key beliefs that our work suggests have seen a shift since the start of the pandemic, with the right-hand side highlighting some things that we think people need to feel convinced about if they're to support new care models longer term. So just to continue with the example of virtual consultations, our work suggests clinicians and patients forced by circumstances into giving remote care a go often found that, at least when other options weren't available, digital consultations were able to offer a high quality clinical interaction. So that in turn starts to shift their attitude to change in that area. That's critical to the speed of uptake during the immediate pandemic response. As they're asked to engage in this as a long-term change in how care is delivered, they'll need to also be convinced that digital exclusion and the impact on working lives will be adequately addressed. So I'm sure you'll have other things you've noticed or beliefs you disagree with here, but I just find this a helpful way of getting beyond a kind of generic conversation about clinical or citizen engagement or resistance to change, so that we can focus on the specific things people will need to believe to support the next stage of change. The final element of our model recognises that those beliefs and what's possible in terms of resources and tools are heavily influenced by the wider context. So we focused on the role of regulation and organisational incentives. Now, as leaders, we need to understand and seek to influence that context, whether we're helping to create the policy and support environment for providers, or working at a local level, helping staff to respond to external expectations. Our work highlighted that this wider context also changed in important ways during the pandemic. So people highlighted these as the key enablers. So, for example, we've heard people talk positively about the combination of clarity from the top together with agency to solve problems at the front line, with regulation and financial rules relaxed in ways that made innovation easier. Understanding of inequalities, time for service change amongst certain staff groups, and attitudes to service quality were also shaken up during the COVID response. If the system reverts under pressure to a more centralised way of directing change, with multiple expectations on providers and little protected time for introducing changes, this is going to limit what's possible at the front line. And so we should focus on leaders on trying to influence these factors or the impact that they have. Looking ahead, not only might some of those enablers be at risk, but our work suggests there are barriers to change that may become a more significant drag on the pace of change. So we think that there's real concern about digital exclusion. And some of the new care models that have been introduced rely on collaboration between organisations and community solidarity that may become strained when financial and performance incentives make themselves felt in ways that they weren't as the system was focused on its shared response to the pandemic. So you'll be able to read the full analysis next week, but in the meantime, I hope that gives us enough to spark our conversation. I'd be really interested to hear your views in the chat and the thoughts of the panel on what you see as the key service shifts, what's enabled them, and what you think is needed now if we're to maintain momentum. Neil, back over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Penny, and some great reflections there, especially I think on the wider context in which innovation takes place, which often I think we look at individual innovations in isolation and say, why aren't they spread everywhere? Instead of looking at the ground on which we're walking, and that ground is obviously changing and fascinating. I mean, the way in which the centre behaves, it'll be interesting to see Hugh's views about this, but the way the centre behaves, and then again, how leaders locally empower their clinical staff, and how there has been a real freeing up of people during some of this extraordinary period when some of the normal constraints were lifted there too. So a lot about empowering and motivating and changing culture. Okay, let's hear some serious panel reaction to that and further thoughts about what's been happening. Zoe, could I start with you?
Thank you, Neil. I'd also like to thank Penny, Matthew and the whole team at the Health Foundation, because this is a fantastically comprehensive piece of work and a lot of these issues that have been raised really resonate. So just to pick on a few things, I think we can't underestimate the really difficult context, and obviously, as Penny has said, we wouldn't want to recreate that, but I think there are some elements that we should think about how we recreate. So I'm thinking, for example, around the common purpose that's been really important. Is there something we can get people behind, and is that maybe about a truly new patient experience of the health service and the care they receive? The other thing that springs to mind is the relationship between risk and innovation. So a lot of these innovations, I think Raj said it, have been around for a while, but suddenly people were given permission to try things, and there is something about the risk appetite that we all need to hold on to, and I think all of us and regulators and others have a role in making sure that culture is actually maintained. So one of the things we've been talking about is the different innovations, the different service changes, and I think for me, if we can recreate the way we think about that, and actually instead of talking about the individual innovations, think about the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So actually, rather than putting in place a single digital tool or a single solution and saying that's what needs to scale, if we can say, what are we trying to achieve for patients? What will be different? What are we trying to achieve for our staff? What are the real outcomes? And the advantage of thinking in that way is that enables different organisations, different localities who've got different needs to come up with different solutions that meet their needs. And it also drives future innovation. So it may be that this particular solution has led to improvements, but actually there might be even better ways of doing that in the future. So thinking about the outcomes we're trying to achieve through the innovation rather than actually the things themselves. And I guess the final point I would want to bring out is the need to evaluate. So there will be impacts that we don't fully understand. There'll be very long-term impacts of what's happened. Some of those will be good, some will be bad, and the complexity and the multiple changes happening all at once will make that very difficult. So there's a lot of talk at the moment now about the rapid pragmatic evaluation, so we can test things as we're going in a very agile way, but actually there will also be a need for further research to actually really understand some of the long-term impacts. Okay, thank you.
Zoe, thanks very much indeed. I think that issue about evaluation and I mean, in the past, sometimes I think that we've perhaps been too risk averse and saying, well, we haven't, where is the proof, can I do this, and so forth. So it'll be interesting again how we get that balance right about learning lessons from, and at the same time being very clear that we really do want to encourage innovation on the ground. Raj, over to you.
Thanks, Neil, and great points by Zoe, and I'll try and be additive to the points rather than duplicative. And I found myself with my teams thinking about what we did over the last 3 or 4 months, or longer, I guess it is now, during the pandemic. And looking at the innovations that have happened, the outcomes that we could see, and trying to understand where we're going to go into the future. And that elicited some understandings within our context that we believe are important to us into the future. It's probably worthwhile just saying a little bit about our context. We in Salford Royal and the organisations that we've taken over in the last 4 or 5 years have got a deep heritage around continuous improvement and actually digital. And those were important factors in some of the work that we undertook during the pandemic. And building on those factors, we can see that there's sort of 3 buckets of innovation where we've characterised them in certain ways. Some are innovations that have just got their own momentum and they're flying, and they don't actually need a lot of leadership attention. They just need infrastructure support to continue with the great stuff that's happened. And actually teleconsultation, including video, is one of those, whether that's directly with patients or whether that's clinician to clinician across our specialist services. We see every week developments and innovations happening in that are self-directed, and we've been able to give clinicians the autonomy to get on, design and develop. So the factor there for us was understanding how we don't get in the way. How do we ensure that those clinical leaders are continuing and are able to continue to drive forward, great outcomes for patients, and really importantly, great outcomes for staff where they felt as though their job satisfaction was increasing as a result of the innovations. There's some key questions for us there. Second of the 3 buckets, I call them, are where we saw some really good outcomes, but we seem to be regressing. That's primarily in the urgent care bucket, where we did some brilliant things around supporting patients in their own homes, reducing the demand in community services, reducing the demand in our 4 EDs. At the back end of patient flow, we saw some really, really good work that enabled safe discharge at a pace that we've never seen before. But we can see some of that stuff regressing. And some of the key focus that we're putting time and attention into there is about governance, about organisational boundaries, about risk tolerance between community primary care and secondary care, and how we're not enabling some of the changes that are desperately needed on things like who is accountable for patients in that mixed patient pathway. How we need to work on that to support our clinical teams and operational teams to work more effectively and in the manner that they did during the surge. And the third bit about gaps. In everything we did, some really great stuff. What we have recognised is there's some gaps in the innovation landscape that we need to close, and those are primarily around productivity. So for some of our services, productivity and therefore capacity has been decimated because of the impact of infection control, and seeking to understand how we can adapt to new ways of working to raise our productivity, whether that's in endoscopy, elective services, and so on and so forth. It's hugely important to us, and that illustrates to our team and to our board a really important priority about making sense of the environment in which we're at, how we effectively communicate that sense with our colleagues and with the communities that we're serving, and how we collectively move to positions where we have got fewer priorities, where we have got fewer lines of improvement to ensure that we concentrate our effort on those things that are going to be most important at this time as well as across the medium term. I'll stop there now.
Thanks very much indeed, Raj. Finally, move on to Hugh. Your thoughts on this.
Thanks, Neil. And again, I'll try not to sort of repeat things and maybe draw out some other points. And I think for me, there's an important point around almost distinguishing the sort of what around the positive changes. And by that, I mean the sort of what are the specific things, what are the new developments, the new innovations, the new approaches that we have implemented during this time, and the actual changes to service, and distinguishing that from the how, whereby, and we've already touched on the sort of different risk appetite, the ability to introduce innovations much more quickly. But also, I think one of the things I've heard welcomed an awful lot was the sense of a much more permissive environment. One where, and I think this is such an important point. If you look, and it's something I've been banging on about for quite a while now, if you look at the really successful industries and organizations in any sector, they've tended to move away from the traditional sort of command and control. The sort of executive level deciding, here is how we do something, here is what we need to do. And the successful organizations, and this is well established now, tend to sort of have clarity around, well, what's the objective? What's the outcome we're trying to achieve? And they focus on having the right people coming together, the right skills, but much more that there is local determination on the how. So that the actual vehicle for delivering the change is left to local determination within a framework. And the important thing is about delivering the outcome. And successful organizations have cracked that because it gives much greater agility to local circumstances. And I think we've done that really well. I mean, we've talked about some of the examples, but another really good one, for instance, is the Nightingale approach. We had the phenomenal success of actually creating a 4,000 bedded sort of hospital effectively in London in the space of 10 days or so. But we didn't try and say, right, every other region has to create the Excel. What we said is the outcome was important, and each region adapted that local circumstance or to their local circumstances to achieve the same outcome. And that was I think, an illustration of what was really successful about that approach. And it's that I think we have to capture moving forward is we focus much more on the outcomes and creating the opportunity for a permissive environment where local determination on the how is there. But I think underpinning that as well is we need also to build the links and to create learning across the different regions and across systems, so that we don't end up with 7 different solutions, but that we're actually sharing, we're learning from each other. And I think that was one of the other things, positive things out of this period in terms of the how. I think there was an acceleration around place-based solutions. I think there was an acceleration on taking down boundaries between organisations and different sectors. That was also true in the area of innovation. So we took down what were quite slow methods for innovating, and we brought people together to find solutions much more rapidly. A classic example of this was the crowdsourcing platform, the Crowdicity platform that we used in terms of ideas around how we could increase testing. So we actually created quite an open platform using the crowdsourcing platform. And we had hundreds of people contributing ideas about how they felt that testing, including from industry, including from academia, including from organizations, from independent people. And the ideas, it was quite an open forum. It moved very rapidly. There were dozens of ideas that were taken up and utilized. So the how, I think, is capturing some of the changes in the way which we did things. Now, I would sound a note of caution, because it's very easy on something like this to say we must retain that approach. But we know that once we get to a slightly more stable period, things will start to stabilize again. They'll start to solidify. So we actually have to really work really hard in this period to make sure that if we're going to have a different approach, that we capture it now. I have a good friend who works in Iceland, and he talks about having a sense of deja vu, that in 2008, in the banking crisis, their health system and economy all but collapsed. And they experienced, I suppose, a bit of what a lot of us are experiencing now, which was having to move rapidly, having to deal very quickly with things to find solutions, working outside the box. But their lesson from that point was they were surprised at how quickly things solidified once stability returned. They felt they would have an opportunity to take some of the learning, review it, and for months and years ahead to embed the best parts of it. I think we have to be realistic that when we talk about innovation and moving really rapidly, when things stabilize, the emergence of governance and audit and managing risk will re-emerge, and will be an anchor or a sort of on that approach we've had over the last number of months, where we're able to move quickly. So there'll be almost a tendency to draw back. So I think we really need to use this period and this opportunity to make sure that we embed different mechanisms on the how, not just grab the sort of positive changes that have happened during these months as well.
And how far, Hugh, do you think that means that the centre itself has to, and I don't just mean your organisation, I mean regulators, the whole panoply of government has to, and I don't know, this is a realistic question, has to rethink what its relationship is. There's clearly on the ground, and it's nothing new, but there's sort of frustration about, worried about top-down central control, all that kind of, that rhetoric is very strong at the moment. Do you think that there is, and it's very easy to have rhetoric at the centre saying, well, of course, we recognise that and so on, but do you think that that the change will come, and is there a recognition at the centre that means something possibly quite different from the way things have been done in the past?
I think there is a recognition. I talked earlier about mentioned the beneficial changes work we're doing. One of the absolute central themes that came through out of that was what was described as the permissive environment. And it was essentially capturing in 2 words that we need to move much more to a sort of creating the clarity, creating the framework clear, creating the objective that needs to be achieved. but actually supporting devolvement of the how much more. And it's not, I hear at the centre all the time the recognition of that is one of the things that have worked really well. But we actually have to find the ways to change the behaviours, because I think there are almost a set of behaviours that have been learnt or are almost quite natural in the centre whenever things, we're struggling with things, is almost to try and pick up the reins and control the solution to those things. I don't think there's any evidence that has worked terribly well. And so the evidence during this period is actually to the contrary. When we create the clarity about what we want to achieve, that actually the best outcomes have happened whenever we support the local how and delivery. And if there are areas which are struggling, we connect them up with areas which are succeeding, we're sharing, we're creating that learning system. And we look to support, I think for me, this is about support, creating the learning systems rather than mandating. I don't think we can sit in the centre and think, well, we can control, even just in secondary care and delivery organisations, you can control 230 trusts from the centre by pulling the reins. That has to be about creating the framework, creating the objective, creating the environment and the skills for the local how, the local delivery to take place. And so I think conceptually everybody gets that, but it's actually about how we change some of the behaviours and approaches so that actually we really do capture that permissive environment moving forward. And I love the phrase in the publication that Penny's just talked about, which is that top-down clarity, bottom-up agency. And that's what we've got to try and embed into our processes and systems.
Thank you very much, Hugh. I think that's an issue which we'll definitely return to, put it that way. I think there's an awful lot of interest in how we get that right. And even if you look at something like the NHS plan, I can't actually remember how many different targets and things it's got in it, but quite a lot. And of course, one has to have sympathy actually for people at the centre, not least in terms of the accountability in the wider sense for how well the system is operating. So big challenge. Let me now hand over to Penny, who's going to focus on the introduction of video consultations, so how this could be a positive exemplar of sustainable change. And this is based on learning from a Q Insight project exploring the introduction of video consultations in different parts of the UK. Penny.
Brilliant, thank you, Neil. Okay, so I'm just going to share a further bit of material to get our teeth into. So this is from an Insight project that we ran for 12 weeks at the start of the pandemic, with 50 people involved in implementing video consultations. Jo, who's the lead researcher for this piece of work, is here and able to respond to your questions or thoughts in the chat. We've also done some interesting analysis and review of the evidence in this area, which we'll share in the chat and on the webpage when we share the recording of this webinar. We thought we'd focus on video consultations because the shift from face-to-face to virtual appointments is surely one of the kind of exemplar changes of the pandemic. So we thought it was a good opportunity to learn lessons that will be useful in making the most of this and other service innovations. And indeed, given this is such a high-profile change for many clinicians and patients, people will be watching how we handle this, which is going to pave the way or otherwise for wider digital service transformation. So to bring us back briefly to the framework I used earlier, if the move to virtual consultations is one of the key shifts that we're seeing, I'm going to use the next 7 to 8 minutes or so to explore what has enabled the change so far and what more is needed for this to become an embedded part of healthcare long term. And I'll draw out the mindset, so the human as well as practical conditions that need to be in place for this work to thrive. Quite a key dynamic is that the way people are thinking about and engaging in this work is changing as the pandemic unfolds. So the motivation and energy for doing this during the first weeks of lockdown is different to the rationale and nature of the task when dealing with a backlog in the context of staff fatigue. We can't simply extrapolate from here to what's possible and attractive to people in terms of long-term shifts in healthcare delivery. So this is obviously an important nuance that we know is going to be critical when we're leading this work. So I'll draw that out as we go along. If we think back to what's happened since March, it's a really incredible achievement to have moved from just a handful of virtual consultations in some services to hundreds of appointments being held by phone or over video within a matter of weeks. And it's not just warm words to start by stressing that it was people that made this happen. It's really clear that this change relied on teams working well beyond reasonable expectations of their role or hours and collaborating despite silos that would normally have got in the way. So our work highlights 4 interlinked things that enabled and inspired this discretionary effort and rapid progress. So the urgent drive to provide some form of care when face-to-face wasn't possible provided a clear shared purpose that spoke to the core values of clinical teams. While the work was incredibly challenging, people found it hugely rewarding to be contributing to a positive change, part of a wider effort. People told us that there was reasonable alignment of action at all levels, with public health awareness campaigns, meaning patients were willing to give it a go, as clinicians were. Central priority and resources were coupled with a sense of autonomy to make decisions locally, as Neil and Hugh were just talking about. And in the absence of clear evidence, forced to learn as they went, frontline teams found that they could make great progress by experimenting and adapting, describing how useful improvement methods like PDSA cycles proved when needing to make informed decisions fast. And we saw through Q that people gave time and priority to reflecting and sharing with others and found that really useful. So there's a lot that we can learn that's positive about what's been possible. I think this quote sums up quite nicely how these different factors came together in a way that added up to a way of working that felt palpably different. I know from many years of working in the NHS, the prospect of a new technology being introduced isn't always something that makes you skip into work. And so what happened with video consultations is worth celebrating. Yet I think it's actually respectful to what's been achieved so far rather than belittling it, to say loud and clear that there's still a long way to go. So we've seen a kind of exponential growth in the number of appointments happening over video and the different settings in which it's being used, with plenty of inspiration from Scotland and Wales to add to what's happening in England. So for example, the Near Me system, which is the supplier across Scotland, has recorded over 16,000 consultations since March. In secondary care, we've seen large increases in the absolute number of virtual appointments happening, but it's less clear what this is as a proportion of the overall outpatient activity pre-COVID, given so many routine services were stopped. One of our participants described a picture which may be fairly typical, where most colleagues in her trust using video used it only for a small proportion of their appointments, with just a very small number of super users using video over 80% of the time. In primary care, almost all practices were rapidly given the technical capability to do video consultations, but even with a 50-fold increase in the number of video appointments, the proportion is still small. So almost all virtual consultations are happening by phone, with photos often used rather than video. The reason for going into this is to emphasise there's a kind of delicate balance for leaders. Yes, we want to celebrate what's been achieved and what that could offer long term, but people also need to hear us recognise that more needs to be done to embed video as part of a sustainable, high-quality model of care. If people don't hear that, they'll worry, perhaps understandably, that we won't give rollout and embedding the time, resources and attention it deserves. So our work suggests that there are 6 things that need further action now if we're to keep people with us and maintain momentum. When we start talking no longer just about what's needed to provide an immediate alternative when there can't be face-to-face contact, but describing virtual appointments as a permanent feature of healthcare, it's natural there'll be additional questions and considerations that come more vocally into play. So there are distinct concerns about digital exclusion. While I think people recognise that there can be benefits in terms of access, they need to see much more active attention given to inequalities if they're to back this wholeheartedly for their patients. Some really great examples emerge through this work. So, for example, there are partnerships to help upskill care home managers, or people providing access to community hubs to give people local confidential spaces for consultations to take place. Connecting Scotland programme is getting 50,000 low-income Scots online. While there are good ideas out there, these will need to be much more widespread. The shift to video is far more than a technical change, but there are important infrastructure factors that need more investment. So decent kit and broadband, for example, but also video consultation platform functionality that works with different service settings and changes to the estate so that new ways of working are easy. There's a long way to go to build the evidence base about the circumstances in which virtual appointments are appropriate and how best to implement them. And we need to support shared learning long term as people work out how to translate that emerging evidence into their particular service context. So we've heard that having time for reflection and collaborative learning and improvement has been key in practical problem solving so far. It's a really important ingredient of successful implementation, so people need permission to see this as real work. We need to recognise that this change will have significant implications for staff, from the well-being of people wrestling with video conferencing fatigue to role design and training for support and clinical staff being asked to adjust to a very different pattern of caregiving. And ultimately, it's a somewhat wasted opportunity if we just replace face-to-face interactions with video without really thinking about the model of care that's needed. It's when there's a critical mass of activity happening virtually or as part of a wider shift to digital that benefits for organisations and populations could really start to kick in. But change of this nature is rarely fast or simple, and it will have significant implications for staff. All in all, when we talk about creating the conditions for ongoing improvement, in the case of video consultations, this means giving proper attention to these 6 areas while not losing ground on the enablers in yellow. So wrapping the tools, resources and incentives around the work done so far in a way that will allow ongoing evolution. It'd be great to hear in the chat whether these findings resonate with you. I'm looking forward to hearing the panel's views on the key enablers and barriers and what this means for the work of leaders locally and nationally. Neil, back to you to start the discussion.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, Penny. And it just opens up that concept of a very different world. And I think we all knew even before COVID that we were heading into something very different. And perhaps as a sector, we've been pretty slow in some ways in embracing the digital revolution. And somehow now we've just had this sort of rapid period of acceleration. But what does that new world mean, and how do we embrace it and take it forward? And how do we bring our staff along with that? I'm going to begin with Raj, and then I'll bring in other panel members as they would like. But let me begin with Raj, who's obviously been dealing with this on the ground, as it were. And I think actually when you mentioned at the beginning, you talked about video consultation. I may have got this wrong, but video consultation was one of the things that flew almost on its own. But obviously sustaining it and making sure that it's taken through will obviously require leadership attention as well. Raj.
Thanks, Neil. I'm just going to talk about some of the hurdles that we face in being able to sustain the benefits of things like video consultation. Because of course, video consultation is part of an overall strategy that an organisation needs to have to understand how we're going to fundamentally alter our operating model to meet the challenges that we face today, as well as the opportunities that digital brings us now and into the future. And I believe we've got a lot of the know-how. I believe we've got the ambition and the will. We've got patients and communities asking us to do these things, and so the will is there in the landscape that we live in. However, one of the key hurdles, one of the key things that gets in the way is how we're currently thinking about funding the digital transformations that need to happen across our organisations. And I'll reduce it down to simple things just for ease of and timeliness, ease of explanation. If we look at the investment that's needed, there's a significant gap between the investment and therefore the cost and the benefit that accrues through the organisation, the benefit that enables us to pay for the cost. That in itself isn't a bar to most, to organisations. You should be able to invest and over multiple years achieve a rate of return that enables you to afford that investment. But within the NHS context, it is a bar. That investment is both capital and revenue. I use this little example to explain what digital really means in terms of investment to colleagues. I argue that for every £10 that's needed for digital investment, about £3 or £4 of it is for the tech and the analytics, therefore the capital bit. The majority, £6 or £7, is needed for workforce change, anything from workforce, skill development, development of new roles, understanding how we need to take the advantage of the digital functionality that's presented to us. So that presents quite an odd investment need to us. Coupled with that is the lack of a track record or a clear evidence-based roadmap that gives us the benefits, creates the conditions where it takes a long time to be able to get your business case approved by the various different authorities. By a long time, I mean years, if you're looking for a substantial investment. So understanding how we in the NHS can change the risk profile that leads to that decision-making lethargy that happens. Understanding how we in the NHS can alter the way that organisations are compensated or rewarded for those innovations to enable those organisations to have a consistent path of development across a number of years is hugely important to be able to achieve the true potential of digital, whether that's virtual consultation or artificial intelligence and so on and so forth, that are right in front of us now with great opportunities that are being presented. I'll stop there now. That's okay.
Thanks very much, Raj. I mean, I think that funding point is really interesting. I mean, how far, there's one is there money, is there enough money available coming into the system to do this? The other is the process by which you're getting not just funding for this, but for all forms of capital funding, which I mean, would be astonishing if you told anybody outside our industry that people don't even have a capital plan a year ahead, because I mean, that's not normally how you run a railway. I don't mean don't go into railways, but you know what I mean.
Yes, absolutely. It's really difficult to explain, isn't it, to a colleague from another industry, how we go about our transformation that's capital or investment led. They are incredulous. In fact, I find myself thinking, am I living in an alternative world when I'm looking at some of the plans that we're having to develop to navigate the funding streams that we've got. And essentially what we do is we create business cases just in case there's a funding stream, and we go knocking on lots of doors. I'll give you an example. So we developed a functionality for, it was AI, machine learning led decision making within our organisation. It was going to cost us about £25 million to implement it. It took us 2 years to be able to convince various different authorities and to gather together that money that was needed to spend for that programme. 2 years is a long time. In that 2 years, priorities changed, and we had to redo things because of those changed priorities, which set us back again. And in a pace where we need a fast pace of change, where we've got the opportunity for fast pace of change, where both our staff and patients are demanding that fast pace of change, it's a really significant bar to us. What we can do, of course, but it's not good enough, is to do little bits and pieces of change. The difficulty with that, it's not joined up, and we miss the totality of the opportunity that's available to us.
And presumably the worry at the moment is that the Treasury has been, whether willingly or unwillingly, has loosened the purse strings for now. But of course, they're looking at a pretty terrible set of figures in terms of borrowing and all the rest of it. So the tendency, the instinct will be to be even more controlling, more process driven than even before.
Absolutely, yeah. But we do have the opportunity with the impending spending review of being able to argue a case for the transformation of the NHS based on a digital plan that's multi-year. I would hope that our colleagues in the Treasury would be more willing to invest in those digital plans as opposed to the traditional capital plans that we put in. Because the rate of return is greater.
It's a really important point. Zoe, any thoughts on this?
Yes, just a couple of points. So I think the first also goes back to Hugh's comments earlier about organisational boundaries. And I think the thing that will put those organisational boundaries back up very, very quickly is competing for budget or costs and rewards that fall in different places. So somehow we've got to both find system-wide ways of investing, but also change the tariff and the way in which we pay for services. And we need to do that really, really quickly. I think the second point is something we've been involved in a lot as an AHSN Network, which is supporting the rollout of what has quite often very pragmatically and very appropriately been a single solution that's been procured everywhere. Now, any market isn't best served by a monopoly, and actually what we need to do is have really clever conversations with the providers of some of these digital solutions and say, actually, what we need to do is maintain plurality of provision. So that's partly for resilience, partly for patient choice or system choice, and partly to continue to drive up functionality and drive down cost. Because of course, if you end up with a monolithic supplier, you're not going to do either of those things. So I think there are some very important conversations about how we procure these things. What's the payback to the companies as well as the NHS? Can it be multi-year? And actually these sort of things need to be done very, very rapidly.
And what's your, just in your patch or even more generally, there is obviously STPs and ICSs are evolving institutions, if that's the right word. I'm not sure they're even institutions as yet. But some have got somebody who's digital already appointed, but some don't, do they?
I mean, you're right. I think most, so where I am in London, our ICSs all have somebody who's leading on digital, but the individual organisations have different histories, different legacies. But there's a lots of whatever we build needs to be on top of existing infrastructure. And I completely take Raj's point as well, that actually some of this is about tech and infrastructure, and some of this is about really investing in the change and the implementation. Because, you know, we've done some work in South London, which this is before COVID, looking at the implementation of digital in primary care, and the way in which that's implemented is critically important to determine the uptake. And I think we've seen the uptake drive because of the urgency and the fear and the risk profile. But actually, as people have said, if we don't get this right, people will drop back to previous behaviours.
And the final point before I go to Hugh is, I remember, without dwelling on this anecdote too long, but there was a guy called Alan Enthoven who invented the internal market. And I met him years ago over with Kaiser Permanente, and Kaiser Permanente were going on about how, you know, brilliant their digital was. This is many, many years ago. And I was woeing the fact that the NHS had been so slow to adopt and all this kind of stuff. And somebody then said, I think we need to be honest with Neil. There was a kind of pause, and they all kind of looked down at the table a bit. And one of them said, the reality is, of course, we failed 3 times. And all we did was get up, dust ourselves down, and have another go. And I suppose that just brings out this question of risk, because as you start to do some of this stuff, do we not need to have a greater tolerance of failure? I guess is my question.
And I think that's a question of those who want a permissive environment rather than a regulatory one. And I think we need to allow people to fail, but to try and do it on a smaller scale and learn from it and move forward very quickly.
Excellent. Thank you. Hugh, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I wanted to pick on almost sort of one of the things, because when Penny was talking, she was talking about the video consultation, there was almost a sort of sense of, you know, the video consultations hadn't been as high as they could have been, and telephone consultations were doing more. I'm not surprised by that, and you know, she used the figure of 16,000 in Scotland. I mean, I think we've gone from virtually, you know, a handful of patients using video consultation in secondary care and mental health to we're now at between 50 and 60,000 patients a week that are being seen. So we've seen 750,000 patients on video consultation since March, the middle of March. Which I think when you look at previous sort of projects of transforming the way we do things, it's been phenomenally quick. But I think we have to be clear. Sorry, I think one other point. I think that was possible because actually the digital platform was very simple. It didn't require a lot of training. It was something that could be run off a smartphone or an iPad, and the simplicity of it enabled us to do it quickly. And it's also an illustration, whilst I totally agree we need investment and we need capital, actually the ability to move to the equivalent of 2.5 million outpatients a year seen through video consultation, through a few iPads across the system. Now there's obviously a cost to that, but a relatively low cost. And so I think it is a real success story. I would have expected us to continue, and then primary care is a really good example. I mean, you don't need to use a video consultation if a phone consultation works. So I think it's not the video consultation is the goal, it's the virtual consultation, whatever is the best platform to link. But I think there's almost a more important point. Whilst it's been successful, it's not the goal. We don't want to actually digitalize the current model. What we have to do is actually make sure that we use digital to help us transform the model. And I think when you look at, particularly in the secondary care mental health context, what's actually the purpose of outpatients? And we've had a model which has probably existed for decades. There's a lovely photograph I saw of one of the London hospitals with, its outpatient appointment or department in 1903, and it's actually still in the same building. It's still in the same hall. The seating's changed a bit, and certainly the clothing and hairstyles have changed, but it's essentially the same 115 years later. So the focus actually has to be, and if you look at what's our purpose of outpatients, it tends to be to access advice, a specialist opinion, to get a diagnosis, or to review how the treatment is progressing. But with digital now, can we do that in a very different way? So, in terms of how are people progressing? Well, remote monitoring. If we want to get advice and guidance, can we not get that now in a different way? Is there not alternatives to actually getting how we get that specialist opinion, particularly using digital? Is there alternative ways using different groups and patient groups around the advice and guidance? And so I think the digital gives us an opportunity to change the model. And I think the risk is we look at the virtual consultation and video consultation as if it was the solution. It's not. We have to change the model of delivery, and I think digital is one of is a primary tool, if not the core tool, for helping us to do that. And so we could actually, one example I use is around the ability to measure, sort of Google's contact lens, where you can measure blood sugar and actually transmit the result from that back to a central point. You think about the number of diabetics that we have coming for, even in primary care and secondary care review, and actually you could potentially have that information in real time. Now, what does that mean in terms of changing the model? That's where I think we've got to really get into, and using digital to help us change the model, not just do it in a digital way, the same model.
Thanks, Hugh. And presumably, if you just think of AI and where it's got to now, where it might get to in 5 years' time, those models will be evolving and changing all the time. Not, as you say, so you end face-to-face contact, but face-to-face contact appears in different ways, in different settings, fitting in with something that wraps around it in terms of digital interaction.
Absolutely. I think when you get into AI and biotechnology, the ability to completely, and I think it is important to think about what is the purpose we're trying to do with our current, each step of our current model. And I think that's when we think about AI and biotechnology and digital, the ability to completely deliver the model in a different way that achieves the purpose that we're trying to achieve. It really gives us a real opportunity to redefine the model and do it in a completely different way and a much more effective way.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Hugh, and thanks to all the panel. I'm now going to hand over to Matt, who's going to take us to the final section on some of the support and the resources that may be available as we take forward this conversation and hopefully this transformation of the service. Matt.
Great, thank you so much, Neil. So I think we've had a really great discussion there, haven't we? Made a lot of progress and really got into some of the kind of depth and nuance, whilst also identifying some of the kind of clear priorities. So as Neil said, what we want to do now is start to think about what support and resources we need and you need as leaders for the road ahead to really kind of make the most of all of these changes that we've identified. I just wanted to do a really brief pull back to the positive shifts that you all identified in the first Slido poll. So as we said then, quite a few of you did identify some specific kind of shifts around virtual clinics, remote monitoring and community pharmacies. There's a few comments also around kind of new or renewed priorities around inequalities and empowering patients. But actually most people, and this I guess reflects the discussion we've just had, focused on almost those like underlying kind of ways of working around collaboration within and between organisations and teams, the importance of kind of sharing and reflective practice, and then these kind of cultural factors around faster decision making, agile working and kind of reduced red tape. I guess they kind of support each other, don't they? So that was just a reminder of some of the things that you identified, and also thinking about all of the shifts that have been discussed by Penny and the panel. We just want to hear from you actually about what you need as leaders to really make the most of these shifts. So we've got our third and final Slido poll. So if you could just open it up again on slido.com, it's the same hashtag. If you type it in, you should see it there. Shah's just about to bring it up on the screen for anyone who can't access Slido. I might actually need to stop sharing. There we go. So what do you need to make the most of the positive shifts that have been accelerated by COVID-19? It'd be great to hear from you before we hear more about some of the support and offers that the panel have got planned or are already offering. So please do just take a minute or so to share, have a look at what other people are kind of contributing. Hopefully all the panel can see that as well. I'm not going to try and summarize it now because I don't think I'll be able to do justice to it, but obviously we will kind of summarize this, share a few headlines with you in the write-up, and obviously share any more specific detail with the panel members to help inform their work. So I'll just give you another 15 seconds or so to share your thoughts on that. I think there's quite a lot, isn't there, coming through that reflects the discussion we've had. There's really a whole range, isn't there? Clearly multiple levers are going to be necessary. Great. Okay, like I say, I'm going to hand back over to Neil now, and we're going to hear from the panel about what they've got planned around the support and resources.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Matt. We've got, I think, what we're planning to do is just get each of the panel to say a few words about what they might offer in terms of resources going forward. And I'll begin with the Confederation. You'll have heard a little bit about NHS Reset, which this is a part. I think I touched on at the beginning. This was prompted by, I think, the feedback that we got from a lot of our members, and we've now produced a whole range of different resources. There are 10 themes, which I won't run through, where we've been doing work, and we're producing short reports on each of those, which are as a result of both debates, discussions, webinars, you name it. I think we've done it on each of those areas. And the idea obviously is to complement some of the other work that's being done, not least by the Health Foundation and indeed by NHS Improvement, NHS England and Improvement around the beneficial innovations program and so forth, which you'll hear a bit about at the moment. We're producing the final report, as it were, from the Reset campaign, which is sort of pulling together of some of the other stuff, which is on Monday the 28th of September, and there's a webinar around that. I think it's fair to say that we found the response from the service and our members to the Reset program has been really fantastic, and that simply reflects, I think, the enthusiasm and the interest in trying to really capture something and to make it sustainable as we move forward into the next phase, which I think everybody recognizes. And it's tinged a bit of our conversation and the right enthusiasm that we've had up till now about what we're about to face over the next few weeks and months, which I think everybody accepts is going to be quite a challenge. So if I can move on and just ask Zoe, maybe just to reflect a little on this subject of resources and support, and I'll also get Hugh to react as well.
Hugh, I think it's you first, actually, then Zoe.
Sorry, Hugh first.
Thank you, Neil. Yeah, I've one slide up here, which I suppose is, I mentioned at the outset around the Beneficial Changes Network. And I suppose what we've been trying to do is bring together, you get a sense on from the right-hand side there of the organizations, the sectors, the groups and individuals who've actually been involved and are inputting into the Beneficial Change Network. And I think key bit about it is we're trying to create an actual network and a collaborative where people are sharing ideas. They're talking about what they've seen that has worked. They're sharing that. They're connecting, and they're bringing the ideas into a forum where people are discussing them, testing them. They're also connecting in a way where they're starting to take forward work together. And I think going right back to the point around how do we stop this being a sort of at the center, we decide on a small number of things that have been effective and push these out. This platform, which we've made available, and I think I have also sent the details of how people can access this network, because it's an open platform. So anyone, including anybody from the Q community, can connect into this network. It's on a NHS Future NHS platform, Beneficial Changes. And you register on that platform, and it's open in terms of all the news that's there, all the ideas that are being gathered, the up-to-date sort of learning and pieces of work that people are connecting on. The intention is, with all the sort of partners that we have in the network, is to bring together the learning that we've had jointly and the ideas, once we've made that assessment, into a joint publication towards the end of November, which would capture all the sort of cross-cutting themes and also the very practical ideas that have emerged as the priorities. So I would encourage people to connect in. The platform link isn't on this slide, but it is available. I know, Penny, we could probably circulate that afterwards. And I would encourage people to connect into that, because it will be a very useful repository for information and ideas and innovations that others are taking forward, but also give the ability to connect in with other groups and do joint pieces of work. And that's part of what we're trying to do, is create those opportunities for people within the system to connect themselves and to build their learning systems and learning collaboratives. And it goes back to, I suppose, that top-down clarity and that bottom-up agency.
Thanks very much indeed, Hugh. Really, really useful. And as I said, and at the end, obviously, all this stuff will be available for you to access as well. Zoe.
Thank you. So from the AHSNs, briefly at a network level, we are also producing a range of resources, publications and webinars based on the theme of recovery, and some of those will be linked to the Reset work that's already been described. So here's the web link and the social media. but actually probably of more interest to the Q community will be the support that people can seek from their local AHSNs. And actually, happily, this resonates with quite a lot of the things we've already talked about. So help with sourcing and selecting innovations, and picking up on Hugh's earlier point, not just things that are available now, but actually a bit of horizon scanning about what's coming through the pipeline, what AI might be able to offer in the future. So thinking about sort of now and pipeline of innovation. Pathway redesign, so again, the point's been made, we don't just want to drop in video conferencing into existing patient pathways, we need to take a more fundamental look, and a lot of AHSNs have that change management and pathway redesign expertise, and again, doing that with clinicians and importantly with patients and public. Evaluation, so some of the AHSNs will be able to help you with rapid pragmatic evaluation. I know there's absolutely lots of it going on at the moment, but also pull in academics where something more rigorous or longer term is needed. And again, the point that's been made before about creating learning systems, so AHSNs are member organisations cutting right across all parts of the health and care system, and also academia, patient groups, industry and others, and facilitating these communities of practice and collaboratives where people can be rapidly sharing the learning that's helpful to them.
Zoe, thanks very much indeed. And finally, Penny from the Q community.
Yes, I'll keep this brief. So the Health Foundation is the place to go for independent expert analysis of what's happening, COVID policy, patterns of care, workforce changes, and we kind of invest in research and support for implementing change well. In terms of Q specifically, we're helping people really navigate the opportunities and challenges thrown up by COVID. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but there are lots of open access resources available, and more if you join. Finally, for people who are maybe leaders across an organisational system, I encourage you to think about Q as being an engaged community of people that can provide support for actually implementing well the changes that we're tasked with delivering. And as I mentioned, this year's funding programme, for example, is focused in this territory. So you can check out the Q website if you want to find out more.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Penny. So there you have it. There's the stuff from the Confed. There's a lot of stuff coming out of NHS England Improvement, the AHSNs and the Q community. So quite a lot of support wrapped around the system to hopefully take on this. Can I just thank you all for being part of this. Thank you to our panelists, Hugh McCaughey, Raj Jain, Zoe Lelliot and Penny Pereira for their fantastic contributions. I think it's been a really rich discussion, and I hope that you've managed to internalize it in terms of your own experience, and that you'll also very much take part in all the fora which each of the organizations represented by the panelists are very keen to encourage further dialogue and debate, both at local level, but also as we take forward the national discussions. I'll hand over to Matt. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks Neil, and also a huge thank you to you as well for kind of chairing the session and managing what was quite a kind of far-reaching discussion, wasn't it? Briefly on the next steps before we had ask you to kind of give us a bit of feedback on the session. As we said at the start, a recording, the slides and links to some of the resources will be made available next week. We've had a great discussion, have we? But please keep the discussion going and add your thoughts on kind of Twitter about the webinar specifically and the broader kind of issues that we've raised. And as Penny mentioned, a couple of the key resources that her presentation was based on. First, the longer read on understanding and sustaining the shifts in practice accelerated by COVID will be published next week. And already available on Q's website is the interactive infographic that summarises the findings from the frontline insights on rapid implementation of video consultations.